After the War of 1947-1948, Israel had managed to establish itself as a nation and expand its borders. It left hundreds of thousands of refugees from Palestine living in the West Bank in Jordan and the Gaza Strip, which was controlled by Egypt. And within these large refugee camps, youths began to organize themselves into groups to fight to return to their homeland that they see had been taken from them by Israel. And they organized themselves into militia groups called the Fedayeen. Meanwhile, in Egypt, after the British mandate to rule had finished, the Egyptian King Farouk was in power, but he was seen as a weak figure, and eventually he was overthrown by the military. And Colonel Nasser became Egypt's leader. Now, Colonel Nasser wanted to modernize Egypt, wanted to show that Egypt could be a strong nation without the interference of old colonial powers like France and Britain. And he wanted to build a huge dam across the Nile to create electricity for his new strong nation. So he wanted to build a large dam at Aswan. They also allowed the Fedayeen, these groups from the refugee camps, to operate within Egyptian territory and to operate in Gaza as well, which began to upset the Israelis. And the Israeli army actually ended up attacking an Egyptian army headquarters in 1955, which ended up killing 50 Egyptian soldiers. Now, this caused uproar not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but also in Egypt, and people began to demand that Colonel Nasser took action. Now, it's at this point that Nasser wants to build up the Egyptian military. And the Americans and the British are very reluctant to supply him with the weapons and the finances to do this. So he begins to turn to communist Russia, to the Soviet Union, and they actually managed to secure for him a supply of weapons from Czechoslovakia. Now, this causes America to demonstrate their outrage, and they were initially they'd been giving financial aid to Egypt to help Nasser build the Aswan Dam. They stopped that aid. So at this point, what's gone down as history is the Suez Crisis begins. Now, the Suez Canal runs through Egypt, between the main body of Egypt and the Sinai Desert. It's a very important trade route. Initially, it's very important for ships leaving Britain wanted to go to India as part of their empire to pass through to stop them having to go all the way around South Africa. But in the 1950s, it was incredibly important for oil ships coming from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to pass through the Suez Canal to get the oil to Europe. And in the 1950s, the Suez Canal was still owned by British and French companies. But Nasser was upset that the Americans and their British and French allies had stopped funding the Aswan Dam project. So he declared he was going to nationalise the Suez Canal. So he sent his troops in, and they seized it, effectively taking it from the British and French companies. They began, and just as the British and French did, they charged ships to pass through it. And with the proceeds of the Suez Canal, he would continue to fund the Aswan Dam project. Now, of course, Britain and France were absolutely enraged by this. And they began to have secret meetings with Israel. Now, Israel, of course, wanted to take action against Egypt, not only because they wanted to stop the Fedayeen launching terrorist and guerrilla attacks from Egyptian territory, but also they were upset with Egypt because they were blocking the Straits of Tiran, which is the only sea access to the ports of South Israel. So Israel were very happy to collude with Britain and France to take action against Egypt in light of his siege of Nasser's siege of the Suez Canal. So on the 29th of October 1956, the Israeli army storms into the Sinai, which is a large desert region, and advances rapidly towards the Suez Canal. Now, Britain and France pretend to the international community they had no idea that this was happening and ordered a ceasefire between Egypt and Israel and said, look, we want you to retreat 60 miles from the canal. Now, the Israelis hadn't even reached the canal, so it was just the Egyptian army that were around the Suez. And so, of course, Nasser refused. So, pretending that they were a peacekeeping force, the British and French attack. They do airstrikes on Egyptian Air Force bases, destroying the Egyptian Air Force. And then British and French paratroopers land in the north of the canal and make their way down the Suez Canal, capturing it for the British and French. Now, the world was shocked by Britain and France's actions. The Arab nations stopped selling oil to Britain. Britain turned to the USA and said, look, will you provide us with oil? The USA refused. And there were calls from the United Nations, from Britain, from the Soviet Union, that the British and the French withdrew. Because they were starved of oil, because of the international pressure, Britain and France had to remove their troops from the Suez Canal. And so this was for Nasser and for Egypt seen as a great victory for them. They had stood up to the old colonial powers, they'd stood up to Britain and France, and they had won. They were allowed to effectively control the Suez Canal. And the Russians stepped in where the USA had pulled out, and the Russians began to supply Egypt with the finance in order to build the Aswan Dam. Now, Israel, even though they were persuaded to withdraw their troops from the Sinai Desert the following year, they had again proved themselves to be militarily strong. They'd managed to destroy many of the Fedayeen bases on Egyptian territory, and they'd managed to end the blockade of the Straits of Tiran, and the United Nations made sure that stretch of water stayed open for them. And so tensions continued into the late 50s and early 60s between Egypt and Israel and the other Arab countries. And in 1964, the Arab League held a summit. They met again, and they established an organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization, which aimed to win back the land lost by the Palestinians in the 1948 war. Another organisation was established a year later called Fatah, that's a guerrilla organisation, and they began to attack Israeli targets. So they began to place mines in roads in Israel. They planted bombs in Israeli government buildings, and they had more and more operations coming out of Syria, whose borders were to the north of Israel. In 1966, Nasser, who was worried that it would be seen that Syria was now leading the Arab nations, decided to sign a defence agreement with Syria. And tensions began to continue to build between Israel and Egypt and Syria. In 1967, 3 Israeli soldiers were killed by a road mine, presumably planted by Fatah, and the Israeli retaliated by attacking a whole village in Jordan. Israeli villages would be shelled by weapons that were within Syria, often from the Golan Heights. And also in 1967, the Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian MiG fighters that had been provided to them by Russia to try and fight off a Syrian air mission against Israel. Adding to the tension as well, Egypt wanted to appear strong. It didn't want to appear as if it was being occupied by old colonial powers. So the peacekeeping troops that had been placed there after the Suez conflict were ordered to leave, and once again Egypt took control of the Straits of Tiran and stopped shipping going to the southern ports of Israel. So Israel, by 1967, feared that once again, as has happened before in 1948, that they were being surrounded by hostile Arab countries. And this time they had military advice and weaponry supplied by the Soviet Union, and they feared that they would be attacked by overwhelming numbers very shortly. And so the Israelis decided that the best form of defense was attack. And the Israeli general Moshe Dayan drew up a devastating strategy. So on the morning of the 5th of June 1967, the Israeli army launched the Israeli Air Force launched a huge air attack on the Arab League countries. By lunchtime of the 5th of June, they managed to destroy 300 Egyptian planes before they even took off, and effectively destroyed the Egyptian Air Force. By the end of the day, the Syrian and Jordanian Air Forces had been completely destroyed as well. Having complete air superiority meant that the Israeli land forces could easily be victorious, especially with the intense training and the weaponry that they'd been supplied by America. And they very quickly drove the Egyptian army not only back to the Suez Canal, but they also managed to seize the West Bank from Jordan. They managed to seize the Golan Heights in the north from Syria to stop all the shelling that had been coming from those areas. In just 6 days, the Arab countries had lost 15,000 soldiers, 430 aircraft and 800 tanks, and their pride and prestige was in tatters. Refugees in Gaza and the West Bank now suddenly found themselves in Israeli-occupied territory, and the Palestinians began to lose faith in the Arab state's ability to recapture their homeland for them, and more of the refugees began to turn to guerrilla or terrorist organizations like Fatah to achieve their goal of one day returning to their homeland. And as you can see from this map, the huge change to the borders of Israel in just 6 days. By the 11th of June 1967, they controlled the whole of the Sinai Desert, they controlled the Gaza Strip, they controlled the West Bank, and they controlled the Golan Heights in the north, in addition to the land that they'd captured in 1948. So, tension. So after the ceasefire at the end of the 6-day war, tension continued along the Suez Canal between Egypt and Israel, and there was shellings and skirmishes along the Suez Canal for several years, until the Soviet Union actually placed 20,000 troops in Egypt to end the confrontation there. And throughout the late 60s and early 70s, Fatah continued a guerrilla campaign, sometimes having open pitch battles with the Israeli army, one famously in Jordan. Other terrorist organizations carried out other terrorist attacks to try and further the Palestinian cause, plane hijackings, for example. And there's one famous terrorist incident which caught the world's attention on Dawson's airfield in Jordan in 1970. The Israeli military, in the face of this, continued to build up its strength with American money and weapons. In 1970, Nasser dies, and the next leader of Egypt is Anwar Sadat. Now, Anwar Sadat promises to push the Israeli troops out of the Sinai Desert, and he calls for Russian finance and military help in order to do this. And by 1973, he feels that he's strong enough now to launch a counterattack against Israel. So Sadat and his generals choose the morning of the 6th of October 1973 for the attack. Now, the 6th of October 1973 was Yom Kippur, the Hebrew religious festival of the Day of Atonement. So the Egyptian generals knew that many Israeli generals would be at home with their families for the religious festival. Many soldiers would be at home for the religious festival, and the borders would not be as well guarded as usual. And so, sure enough, with a surprise attack on the 6th of October, they managed to smash through Israeli defences on the Suez Canal, and 80,000 soldiers poured across the canal to push the Israelis out of the Sinai Peninsula. An Israeli tank army was sent to reinforce Israeli positions, but they were quickly pushed back by rocket fire from the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Syrians launched a coordinated attack on the same day, and 1,000 Syrian tanks drove into the Golan Heights to push the Israeli army out. So the Israelis were taken by surprise, mainly because it was the Yom Kippur festival. But the Yom Kippur festival also had its advantages, because when the Israeli military top brass realised that they were under attack, it was easy for them to contact their highly trained reserve soldiers, because they knew that they would be at home. So a quick telephone call and the reservists were quickly in uniform, ready to fight. And as the Israeli army began to deploy and send more troops to Suez and to the Golan Heights, that the roads were empty because it was a holiday. And so they were quickly able to mobilize their troops. America as well rushed weapons, $2,200 million worth of weapons and aid to Israel to stop the Egyptian and Syrian offensive. And so this was very successful. The Israeli army managed to stop and then begin to push back the Syrian attack in the north. And on the 14th of October 1973, the Israeli army once again launched a massive tank army into the Sinai Desert, and there was the biggest tank battle to that date in the 20th century on the Sinai Desert between the Egyptians and the Israeli army. And the Israeli army in that tank battle lost just 10 tanks compared to 250 Egyptian tanks. Faced with this military defeat, the Egyptian army was pushed back to the Suez Canal and beyond. And the Soviet Union began to really worry that if Egypt was defeated, then its allies would disappear completely. But the Americans also wanted a quick peace, because they feared that if Israel completely obliterated Egypt, then actually it would mean that the Soviet Union would be able to increase its influence over the other Arab countries. Also, the other Arab states had also used the oil weapon again, and they decided to increase the price of oil to the Western countries 4 times. And so with increased oil prices, the economic chaos that brings, the US ordered the Israelis, persuaded the Israelis to disengage and to organize a ceasefire. So a ceasefire was put into operation, and after several years of talks, peace was finally found in the 1979 Camp David peace agreement. Camp David being the President of America's holiday retreat. And as we can see here, we can see Jimmy Carter, the American president, who negotiated the peace between Egypt and Israel. And Israel agreed that it would gradually, over the next few years, leave the Sinai Peninsula. They agreed that they would allow some self-governance for the Palestinian refugees on the West Bank. Egypt, for their part, would allow Israeli ships to use the Suez Canal. But the key thing is that by Sadat actually enter into these talks with Israel, he was effectively recognizing Israel's existence as a country, which Arab nations had refused to do up to this point. Now, this very fact in itself caused outrage across the Arab world. Many of the leaders of the other Arab countries, such as Jordan, denounced Sadat for doing this, and even within his own country, there were thoughts that he had betrayed not only Palestinians but the Arab world as a whole. And this led 2 years later to his assassination by angry, radicalized Egyptian soldiers, a military parade that was put on every year, which is supposed to celebrate the Egyptian army's early successes in the Yom Kippur War, but it was where Sadat met his fate.